Hello, my friend. My name is Wa-Kyendo, and I've got questions. Today's question: what is wealth? Now, I want to answer these series of questions, right? What is wealth? And I'm going to divide it into two sets, right? First set is how do nations become wealthy? What is wealth? How does the division of labor generate wealth? Etc. Like the other questions that you can see in front of you. Why don't you build a table on your own? Wealth, human ambition, and teamwork. And then finally, demand and supply. How do you get rich because of teamwork and the work of other teams? Then the second set of questions, why should you care what governments do? So, first point about how people get rich at the expense of others, how wealth is dependent on and defined by relationships. How does the collapse of government explain the connection between relationships and wealth? And how can government make you poorer? What is wealth? So, Adam Smith is regarded as the father of modern economics. Wealth is defined by Adam Smith as the annual produce of the land and labor of the society. This labor, or this produce rather, satisfies human needs and wants. Wealth is also understood as the value of assets under one's control. Assets can themselves be defined as objects of subjective utility. An asset can be understood as any object that offers utility to a person. In addition to embodying a quantum of value, an asset has a degree of convertibility that contributes to its desirability. How does the division of labor generate wealth? Why don't you build a table on your own? Now, Adam Smith states that the extent of the market is dependent on the extent of the division of labor. The extent of the division of labor is a phrase that describes how disaggregated a production process is in terms of the number of tasks assigned to a person and what this means for the amount of wealth that is enjoyed by those participating in that process. Now, and the phrase the extent of the market itself, this it really means the amount of wealth that is up for to be claimed, right? So the extent of the market is actually the extent of our wealth as participants in that specific market. Now, in every process, there are raw materials that are gathered together, organized, and transformed from one state into a desired state. For example, to make a table, trees are cut down and transformed into lumber, which is then transformed once more into a table. This process involves a lumberjack who cuts down the trees and turns them into lumber, and carpenters who turn the lumber into tables. Furthermore, the process may also involve lorry drivers who transport the lumber from the forest into the warehouse where it is stored until it is transformed into a table by a carpenter. If one gets even deeper into the weeds, so to speak, there are manufacturers of nails and other inputs that will help hold the table together. If one person had to cut down the trees, turn them into lumber, carry them to a warehouse, turn them into, uh, or rather, maybe you turn them into lumber at the warehouse, and then produce tables and chairs out of them alone, making tables and chairs would be a tedious process. Furthermore, if the carpenter had to build his own chainsaws, tough clothes with which to engage in lumberjacking, trucks to carry the lumber, and then tools to transform the lumber into wood and then into tables and chairs, the whole enterprise would be excessively tedious. In fact, the carpenter would resort to building simple, poorly made tables and chairs on which to sit on, simple, poorly made clothes to wear, simple, poorly made tools to use, simple, poorly made wheelbarrows, and so on and so forth. This was the very predicament faced by prehistoric man when 35,000 years ago he engaged in the enterprise of growing his wealth. Today, due to the process of the division of labor, which leads to specialization, individuals can consume and do enjoy the wealth that others produce. So the question that one is left with is this: would you rather spend 100 million US dollars on making everything yourself, or would you rather buy these things from others? Right? If you're given 100 million and you have the choice, either buy whatever you want, it is you want to spend this money from other people, or make every single thing yourself. Think about that. So human beings are different from any other being in nature because they can imagine complex things and come together to build the things that they imagine. Furthermore, because the most complex things, that is, the things that require a lot more transformation than a simple table, cannot be built alone, human beings have an incentive to subordinate their aims to the singular objective of building something complex together. This is a direct repudiation of a certain notion promoted by, say, political scientists. The man has only his self interest to drive him forward. It also challenges another myth that people are self made or they do everything themselves, and at least invites us to ask what role other people play in that process. So, in actuality, or rather, you could say that man is driven to join others to build something bigger together. The division of labor is driven by shared ambition. Now, the greater the ambition, the greater the number of people that must share in that ambition. In order for it to be actualized. So, in a sense, taking the utility of the ambition for granted, the and complexity of the ambition is part that must choose to come together to meet that objective. Okay, let's pause there for a second. Not necessarily a number of people. I should correct that phrase. It's the amount of knowledge that can be fit into a person's head. So you could think of it as the economist. I think it's Ricardo Hausmann and his partner. Let me just look up his name, Ricardo, because I really want to give him credit for this. Cesar Hidalgo. Now, the point of that is this, right? Cesar Hidalgo puts it in these terms, says person bites, right? So the scale and the complexity of an ambition is requires a certain amount of person bytes, right? Person byte being the amount, let's say one person byte is the amount of knowledge that you can fit in one person, right? And that person bytes, you need a certain number of person bytes in order to build whatever it is you want to build. So let's say a Lexus, right? The idea is if you could measure it, you would, what you see is that one person cannot build that Lexus vehicle alone. He's got to get help. They've got to come put together teams of people to do this thing, you know. So you can't know enough to do anything of significant scale alone. So this implies that an individual becomes wealthy when they optimize resources that they will deploy in a productive process, including by engaging in the division of labor. deepening and widening their level of expertise, both at the individual and group level, through sustained engagement with a wide range of difficult tasks to a deep degree of knowledge. In other words, one gets rich by working with others, and one enjoys wealth by consuming the work of others who also work with others. And that specialization, right? Having command in a certain area of knowledge is an important step towards wealth generation. When one works with others towards highly ambitious ends, productivity and efficiency are improved. In his seminal work, The Wealth of Nations, Adam Smith stated that wealth is the annual produce of the land and labor of the society. So, produce again is defined as a good or service that satisfied human needs and wants. That is, there are activities that man finds are of utility for him and that he is willing to pay for. So, now productivity and efficiency are not a given. Like, you actually have to organize yourselves, right? Divide the labor in a way that makes sense, right? That's the work of an entrepreneur, a group of entrepreneurs. They find out how it makes sense to divide that labor, and then they put themselves to work. So, how do you get rich because of teamwork and the work of other teams? If a woman has an interest in a certain thing and she's able to make a legitimate claim for that thing, that is, that she can afford to obtain that thing through legitimized means of purchase, right? Of making claim, like money, then that thing is valuable to the woman and she has generated demand for it, right? Effective demand, willingness and ability to buy, right? So, right here, effective demand, willingness to buy, and the ability to buy. If someone wants, or a group of people have an interest in an ability to produce that thing that the woman wants, that group constitutes an entrepreneur, a firm, or a group of firms that can generate supply for that thing. That is, if they have again, the interest and the ability to produce that thing. So, in other words, wealth is created where demand meets supply, where producers can effectively produce what consumers can effectively ask for. And producers optimize their resources and manpower through the division of labor and specialization, and are therefore seek to achieve efficiencies and productivity. The division of labor and specialization allow for products that could not be produced without collaboration between vast networks of highly knowledgeable people. The iPhones, the Gucci bags, the luxury sedans, and the flat screen televisions that have become such a feature of modern life were unavailable to kings of old. Furthermore, whereas in the recent past, products like flat screen televisions were available to the wealthiest of us at a very high cost, these same devices are available to the poorest among us at much lower costs. This means that people become wealthy when they work with others to do hard things and solve hard problems for people who regard these problems as of the highest importance, or they have an interest in solving them, right? Whatever rank of importance they are important to them. Furthermore, this means that people also get wealthier because other smart people are willing to work together to solve very difficult problems. People work on our behalf even as we seemingly do nothing. Because of their hard work, we can purchase flat screen televisions for cheap. Because of the hard work that others do and the sweat that others generate, we become wealthier even as we do nothing. The government's only job, therefore, is to do things that keep people working together voluntarily while refraining from doing things that pull people away from each other, leaving them less productive and efficient. So and make it difficult for them to come together, and then taking away all that they have earned through taxation, whose revenues and then expenditures remain unjustified. Your wealth is tied to the stability of your society, teamwork, and the amount of specialized, in demand knowledge that you possess. So, get getting rich at the expense of others. If stealing is immoral, unwarranted claims on your wealth by the state are also immoral. One can take actions that, by design and by consequence, accumulate agency towards themselves while ensuring that the chances that others can accumulate agency are incumbent. Now, agency here can be thought of as, how much ability do you have to do whatever it is that you want? You'll notice that you're limited because you have a contract perhaps with your office. There is the law. There's all manner of constraints on your behavior and the things that you can do. But that money also offers a certain level of agency. You can probably, maybe you can do some things that you can't do without money. You can quit your job. You can travel the world. You can buy expensive things. That means you have a so someone who can buy more things than I can has more agency than I have. So this means it's possible and it does happen that some people make themselves wealthy at the expense of others, and they erect obstacles for others to stop them, or to stop them from attaining the same levels of wealth. So you put up obstacles to stop others from moving, or just even to obtain the same level of wealth as you. For example, the chemical factory that dumps waste in the river and pays bribes to the regulator sent by the government gets rich, destroys the livelihood of others, and removes any instruments that others can use to stop them. So, this is an example of an individual or a group of individuals who not only accumulate agency towards themselves, but they ensure that others cannot enjoy a high level of agency. One might say that many systems of virtuous thought and action understood this proclivity in man and preached against it and organized against it, and rightly so. So that's to say, for example, systems of religion, systems of philosophy. Some of these systems sought to actually uphold virtuous thought and action, and to enforce action against thought and actions that were not virtuous. Because one way to think about what virtue is, and I'm not going to limit it, is that virtue is, whenever people take action that expand their own agency and the agency of others, you could say. And you could also say, maybe I expand my own energy, but I am agency, but I don't obstruct, I don't block others from accumulating agency on their own. So then, this brings us to deeper into the second set of questions that we sought to explore. That is wealth and relationships. So, really, this set of questions is trying to get us thinking about how it is, like, why should we care what government does? Now, we know that we should care intuitively. It's not something that is a mystery to us. But how is wealth dependent on and defined by relationships? So the control of things of value includes rights of ownership and allocation of those things. A property is owned by a specified party and may be allocated as the owner wishes. The prevailing system of law places limits on ownership and allocation of property. An individual is free to allocate property as they wish. These freedoms are limited by a social agreement called the state. Let's see. Maybe you can try it. Oh my gosh. I didn't even realize the lighting. Okay, well. So the state is itself restricted so that it cannot exercise arbitrary control over the rights and freedoms of the individual. Put together, allocative actions constitute claims on property and non physical entitlements and obligations that are checked by the network of social relationships. This is to say that freedom, the ability to do whatever one wants at any time and however one wants, is enhanced, maintained, and limited by our relationships with others. Our relationships create the fence around which our wealth is kept safe, right? If you extend the definition of the relationship to even the state itself, right? So our relationships contribute to the generation of wealth that we enjoy. Now, how does the collapse of government explain relationships and wealth? Although wealth is imagined in a sense that is detached from social life, the disintegration of the state quickly reveals that a combination of incentives of, say, coercion, rational or scientific based thought, tradition, and shared higher order goals are important enablers of the generation and the safeguarding of wealth. So wealth is generated in a productive relationship, and claims to its ownership and allocation can be made through theft, violence, charismatic appeal or appeal to reason, right? So there's all kinds of ways that property can be claimed, but we create relationships that limit or try to control these means of making claims. So relationships create boundaries to our actions. Absolute freedom is bounded by the need to cooperate and collaborate with others, but also by a framework of rules, right? Institutions are simply rules. Now, how does the government make you poorer? Because policy is paid for through revenues raised through taxation, policy involves a claim on your private property. A public that remains unconcerned with the workings of government will soon find itself impoverished. This is because there are some enterprising individuals called politicians that are incentivized to make ever escalating claims on your private property and will continue to do so unless they are checked by an active public. So, in all, we try to answer this question of what wealth is and how relationships, how government contributes to our accrual of wealth, and then why we should care what a government is up to. Thank you. See you around.